Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. As airstrikes continue in Syria, the United States and Russia are struggling to salvage what little remains of a fragile ceasefire agreement. The UN has said it will resume humanitarian operations despite the bombing of an aid convoy and the declaration by the Syrian government that it no longer recognizes the ceasefire. So, is there still a truce to be rescued? Can events on the ground and in the air be made to conform to diplomatic hopes? Or will the situation further devolve into multi-party recriminations and violence? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined here in the studio by Victor Gao Zhikai, Director of the China National Association of International Studies, and Rick Dunham, visiting professor at Tsinghua University. But before we begin our discussion here, let's take a look at this.
Jets pounded rebel positions in the city of Aleppo on Wednesday night as a week-old truce collapsed. And yesterday, Syrian government forces renewed their attacks on rebel-held areas of the city. Talks between the US and Russia on reviving the collapsed ceasefire have broken up without progress in New York.
There have been attempts on the part of some of our colleagues to suggest that the government should take unilateral steps, but we insist that the opposition should also take the necessary steps, and to do it in such a way as to prevent al-Nusra and ISIS forces from exploiting the situation.
The simple reality is that we can't resolve a crisis if one side is unwilling to do what is necessary to avoid escalation. And we won't get anywhere if we begin by ignoring facts and plain common sense or denying the truth.
Russia and the United States agreed a deal on September 9th aimed at putting Syria's peace process back on track. It included a nationwide truce, improved humanitarian aid access, and the possibility of joint military targeting of banned Islamist groups. However, the truce effectively collapsed after 1 week when an aid convoy was bombed on Monday and some 20 people were killed. It thrust the UN into emergency mode to salvage the truce, which is meant to pave the way for a political peace process. UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon has expressed outrage at the attack and tried to bring the focus back to ending the protracted Syrian war.
Welcome back, gentlemen. Should we first of all express our deep respect and condolences for those who were killed in the aid convoy? They are the relief workers from the United Nations. I mean, they should deserve our respect. Don't you think this is a very delicate and dangerous situation for the united efforts by United Nations, and particularly by Russia and the United States, to lay groundwork for peacemaking?
Definitely, I think we need to pause and give our condolences for all the victims killed in the bombing, not only during this round of bombing, but also during the previous round of bombing where government soldiers were also killed. And the situation is very tense and it's escalating. And for a while, when the United States and Russia agreed to bring about a ceasefire, it really gave hope not only to the Syrians but to mankind as a whole. But soon it was all dashed into pieces, and I don't think anyone will be able to pick up the pieces anytime soon.
Who is to blame in what amounts to be a blame game at this moment?
Everybody is to blame. I mean, you could argue the Syrian government broke the ceasefire, or you could argue that rebel groups broke the ceasefire. But then when there was the accidental retaliation against the Syrian troops, the U.S. military said it was an accident. The Russians and the Syrians believed they were targeted. Then all hell broke loose, unfortunately, and the aid convoy was hit. Was that an accident? Was that intentional?
Obviously, something must be done to stem the exodus of refugees and to eliminate ISIL. So what should be done next?
And I think all the countries involved, especially the United States and Russia, need to step up and do the unbelievable things. They need to give up their one-sided strategic gamings, for example. They need to stop second-guessing the other side. They really need to agree onto the same page so that the war in Syria can be brought to a halt and the refugees will no longer try to do the exodus from Syria, because otherwise not only Syria itself will plunge into chaos and destruction, but Europe will lose peace and sanity, and it will take years, if not even a couple of decades, for Europe to recover from this major disaster.
How come Russia is being taken so seriously by Washington? If you look at what had happened during the period of eastward expansion of the NATO, particularly the Bosnia-Herzegovina war, Russia was humiliated time and again. But in the Middle East, I mean, since the Arab Spring, President Putin seems to have played his diplomacy proactively, generating a lot of media attention, riveting the attention of the State Department and the White House, seriously derailing its back to Asia process. I mean, what do you think of the successful diplomacy of President Putin?
I think there are three reasons why that is happening. One was he's taken seriously because he took Crimea and eastern Ukraine, so military success. Secondly, he has propped up the Assad regime. That the civil war was quite uncertain at the time Russia came in. Now clearly Assad has the upper hand. And thirdly, when you look at the region, he has helped in the Iran situation and the negotiations there. And so he has shown that he can be an effective player, not only militarily but diplomatically.
Perhaps we have given too much credit to President Putin. Why shouldn't President Obama, laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize, deserve some, not credit, but criticism? For example, he preferred to lead from behind ever since he delivered the policy speech in the West Point Academy, saying simply because you have the best hammer doesn't mean automatically you have every nail you meet will be the best nail. Meaning you'll lead by example and you lead from behind instead of committing ground troops and putting boot on the ground. And that has created the conditions for the escalation of the civil strife. Don't you think the rest of the world feels disillusioned with the American leadership there?
Well, as far as the Syrian crisis is concerned, President Obama and the US government in general do not have that firm determination to deal with the situation as it is. The policy of President Obama as far as Syria is concerned is a policy of avoidance. They do not want to do the right thing. They do not want to make the tough choice. They want to have an easy ride on the situation. And this really created the disarray in those countries which consider themselves to be allies of the United States. And it really let down many countries and many people in that part of the world.
But do you think the evasive nature of this Middle East policy by the Obama administration is part of the Back to Asia strategy, meaning to allocate major resources from the rest of the world to West Pacific Ocean?
It may be.
With China being the potential target.
It may be. However, I think for the whole world, they look at the American leadership as one American leadership. So if you are perceived as very weak and evasive, dodging all the difficult choices in one part of the world, in this case Syria, their so-called American leadership in the Asia-Pacific region will also be doomed because fewer people will sign up on the bandwagon with the United States. More people will believe the United States leadership is weak and is not doing the right thing. They draw the red line, they say there is no more red line, and this will really lead to dashing the hopes of many countries.
But I'm afraid this kind of a weak leadership will be over 2 months from now when President Obama steps down and the next president.
You will have a different kind of leadership no matter who's elected. But let's look back at Obama for just a moment here. He saw what happened with George Bush for 8 years. He did not want the United States to go in, to take a lead unilaterally and get entangled with consequences that it did not expect. The problem is, in this has been described as leading from behind by his critics. The problem is that it lets others shape the agenda, and that's what's happened in Syria, whether it's Russia or whether it is the radical groups who are trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Now, for the next president, Hillary Clinton is tougher. She's more hawkish than Obama, and I don't mean tougher necessarily as a compliment, but it just means she is more likely to intervene militarily than Obama.
But I'm afraid with economic performance being prioritized on the agenda of either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, I wonder if the United States will have enough resources for the Middle East, with China being the focus of their diplomacy and strategy what do you think will be the prospective measures to be taken by this new master in the White House?
Well, first of all, I want to speak to who will become the next president of the United States in the White House starting on January the 20th next year, that treating China as the focus of U.S. foreign policy, as if China is the major threat to the national security of the United States, it may be the wrong choice. It really, if China and the United States view each other as an enemy or potential enemy, then it will waste all the resources of China as well as the United States. And meanwhile, different situations, ISIS, for example, may continue their ascendance. Therefore, the United States and the next president of the United States need to re-strategize to single out the right enemy and mobilize all the resources in the world, including the Chinese resources, to work together to deal with the real enemies, not only of the United States, but mankind as a whole.
Rick, do you think a vision such as aligning all the parties and the victims of the IS-era terrorist attacks behind the banner, that we should act together, stand ready to crush ISL so that we could stem the exodus of refugees and root out origins of terrorist attacks?
I think that's pretty idealistic.
Idealistic.
I think that's one. Everybody except the terrorists there would agree with you that's what we should do. However, Assad and the Russians also want to eliminate the anti-Assad forces in Syria, and as they're letting the United States handle ISIS, and they're continuing to go after the others to keep Assad in power. So the problem is that just eliminating the territory controlled by ISIS is not going to solve the problem. You still will have instability in Syria. You still will have the issues with Iran and Saudi Arabia. You
Exactly,
you still have Israel and the Palestinians.
Right, Victor, my next question is very much about the regional geopolitical rivalry between two major powers on the periphery of Syria, Saudi Arabia and Iran. On the surface of the issue, on the surface of the civil strife in Syria, it's like very much the proxy war between Russia and the United States. Actually, it's also a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So what are the stakes for these two major powers?
Well, I would say the Middle Eastern situation as a whole, and especially the conflict between the Shiites on the one hand, which is more represented by Iran, and the Sunnis, which is more represented by Saudi Arabia, are deeply rooted and very, very complicated, and no one can easily find the easy solution to these decade-old, centuries-old, or even 1,400 years old conflicts. And I don't think anyone should really try their luck as if he or she may be able to bring these conflicts to an end anytime soon.
China is a friend of both. China is a friend of both, Saudi Arabia and Iran. Do you think it's high time for China to exercise its diplomatic influence, leveraging our resources in this fragile part of the world, persuading both to accept the idea that peace and stability will benefit all?
I remember during the 1980s when the U.S. leaders visiting Beijing tried to persuade Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping to assist Iraq in its fight against Iran. Deng Xiaoping said China need to keep a hand at the rear, in the rear, mainly because Deng Xiaoping said, we do not know which one is the good guy or the bad guy. We need to deal with them equally. Eventually, China even sold weapons to both Iran and Iraq, more or less in the equal amount, rather than standing by one side to fight against each other. Eventually, China lucked out, and the United States was dragged in more and more deeply in this kind of conflicts and even war. Today, I think China still need to do the same thing.
Don't you think this is the philosophical dichotomy of the neocons in the United States, that they look at things in black and white terms, but China does not? And therefore, we keep a distance and we keep those major players at bay.
Well, I think China, number one, resists foreign entanglements, doesn't want to get caught up in something that could spiral out of control. And that's why China could try to broker a peace in Yemen, where you have the proxy war close up between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and is letting it go. But in terms of the involvement of China, I think the country has historically tried to stay out of these situations where there's no upside.
Thank you very much. You're watching Dialogue with Victor Gaujika and Rick Dunham. We're discussing why the fragile ceasefire agreement in Syria has fallen apart. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us. Welcome back, gentlemen. Do you think the intransigence of President Assad, the intransigence of President Putin, and the inaction, so-called, quote-unquote, of the White House will somehow lead to a sharp decline in the security scenario in the Middle East? I mean, there's no hope, no silver lining.
I think the crisis in the Middle East, especially involving Syria, will only go worse before it will get better. And no matter who becomes the next president in the United States, he or she probably will not be able to find a quick solution to the Syrian crisis.
But I'm afraid that's the issue that matters 2 months from now. Currently, Saudi Arabia must have been left utterly disillusioned with the diplomacy of President Obama, since President Obama did violate his own promise by stepping in should President Assad violate the red line of using chemical weapons. I mean, of course, the use of chemical weapons remains a controversial issue. We cannot make sure and clarify who, the rebels or the government forces, were the first to use the chemical weapons. But Putin, again, stepped in wisely and inviting the UN nuclear watchdog to supervise destruction of chemical weapons that were shipped jointly by China and Russia. So what do you think of the anger of Saudi Arabia and other allies of the United States who might have lost hope with the United States?
As far as the Syrian crisis is concerned in terms of the rivalry between the United States and Russia, it seems that Russia or President Putin have been successfully outsmarting President Obama. And this is not good for the balance of power in that part of the world, because many countries, including Saudi Arabia, used to look up at the United States as truly a global leader, a world leader on which they can rely on. And when the US is being second guessed and outsmarted by Russia, for example, and when President Putin drew the red line but eat his own word in front of the whole world, how can you restore the confidence in those countries which are so close to you and depend on your leadership for the survival of their nations?
Rick,
that's the crisis.
Do you think the American diplomacy actually follows the pattern, traditional pattern, that if President Obama has been weak, his successor will be a lot stronger and tougher? Anything but Bush, anything but Clinton, ABC or whatever, the rebuttal, a reversal in the foreign policy will come across as a hallmark to usher in a new era. And the same is true with the next White House.
Historically, it is true when one party changes to the other. But you had one situation that was different when Reagan gave way to Bush in 1989, and you had to some degree continuation that shifted again when the Democrats took over. So I think it depends. If you have Trump, then you do have a major shift philosophically. If you have Hillary Clinton, I think it is less pronounced. I think they're on the same page, even if Hillary Clinton is a little more hawkish. I think the point you made about the red line and allowing Assad to cross the red line with chemical weapons is significant, because from that point on, President Obama was maneuvered into a position where he really can only take on ISIS, the Islamic State. He let Putin have the upper hand with protecting Assad, keeping Assad in power. Before then, the United States was ready to try to take Assad out. Now that they let that red line be crossed, they can't really do that. And even John Kerry in his negotiations is not talking about that.
Well, gentlemen, we may only feel tip of the iceberg. For example, the anger of Saudi Arabia. Well, what about yet another ambitious player, Turkey, which is lurking behind the whole security scenario, following the foiled coup, and the possibility that Ankara would align itself with Moscow in forming its own united front, trying to establish their own joint presence in this fragile part of the world. What does that mean for all other major players?
I think the sudden turnaround of Turkey from leaning towards the United States to all of a sudden leaning towards Russia and President Putin in particular is another typical historical example of showing how weak leadership or wrong leadership by the United States may create chaos, not only for other countries, but eventually it may come back to bite the global leadership of the United States. And again, President Putin apparently outsmarted President Obama. And he is probably gleeing in the middle of the night about how smartly he handled the Turkey
situation. He may
situation.
have outsmarted President Obama for this moment, but who will be the guy who smiles to the last?
I mean, I would strongly disagree with the thought of Putin outsmarting Obama on this. I think this is one where you had a coup attempt in Turkey, and Erdogan has done a pivot. There's nothing that Obama did there that would have caused him to make that shift. I mean, I believe it was Erdogan's shift. But there are two significant issues to consider with Turkey if Turkey does pivot to Russia. One is refugees, the question of refugees.
And the other,
Europe.
maybe the issue of the Kurds.
The Kurds is the other. That's exactly right. Because the United States has announced that it will help the Syrian Kurds, which is something that Turkey does not want. And so that could further push Erdogan right now.
That will threaten to further alienate Erdogan should such an independent Kurdistan be established with the powerful assistance of the White House. Now, Russia stepped in and got deeply involved in the civil strife for Syria. Russia stepped in, inviting President Erdogan to visit Moscow when Ankara was so angry with the alleged role of CIA. Now, this time around, the allegation that Russia stepped in to try to influence the process of U.S. elections with hacking would again mess with the White House and all of the decision makers and lawmakers in the D.C. So what's going to happen to the bilateral relationship between Moscow and the White House?
I think there is no hope for resetting the relations between Moscow and Washington. I think Russia is apparently becoming more and more formidably as a foe of the United States, and it should, in the best case scenario, give the United States more incentive to reconfigure its relations with China. But if the United States is unable to do that, then geopolitically speaking, the United States may face increasingly dangerous Russia on the one hand, and then a China which is increasingly bigger and more importantly, not only in terms of economic terms, but also global political terms, and the United States need to really square off with Russia on the one hand and with China on the other hand. And that's the worst geopolitical crisis for the United States in decades.
And what may have fueled the speculation of the conspiracy, according to Victor Gao, is that China and Russia are the two permanent members of the UN Security Council, and RMB has just been included by the special drawing rights of IMF to be one of the major reserve currencies. And China is rising financially. It will continue to be a powerhouse for world economic recovery, to say nothing of the very inclusive ambitious blueprint of the Belt and Road Initiative that's in sharp contrast against the TPP, which is so exclusive, and that includes Vietnam, but at the cost of China's participation. What do you think of the current defiance by both parties across the aisle in the DC against the idea of a TPP?
Well, TPP is in deep trouble, no matter who's elected president. President Clinton might try to revive it at the risk of alienating Beijing. President Trump would just kill the whole thing. I mean, I think that China card, which we heard of in 1972, could come back into play in 2017, and I think Hillary Clinton has a lot of Richard Nixon in her, and I think she sees the threat from Russia, and I would not be surprised if you had a Clinton goes to China moment. With Donald Trump, he's very close to Putin, and the whole world could be different. I mean, who knows if he'd be the junior partner to Putin if you would have China, Russia, and the U.S. together in that formulation, or if he would split and he would make China the enemy.
Well, gentlemen, let me bring you back to the track of discussing Syria and what the future might hold for this war-torn country in the Middle East. What would be the final scenario in this part of the Middle East. Is it an inevitable outcome of having a demise of Syria? This country will never ever be united again. It will never be resumed to what it was during the years of Hafiz Assad, the father of the current president in Damascus.
And I think increasingly Syria is being destroyed as a nation, not only physically but also in terms of the morals of the people, as well as Syrian people as a nation. That's really a very tragic moment.
Don't you think this is a traumatic nightmare for the whole mankind? I mean, so much internal bleeding.
Of course.
So many people left homeless internally and externally.
Of course, you do not need
with the overseas military intervention.
Yeah, you do not need to love Syria. But the destruction and the annihilation and the destruction of the human lives, for example, in Syria, is really staggering. No one should glee at the destruction in Syria. And I think all of us need to learn the bitter lesson, how to handle a situation like this. And I think China did the right thing and is been doing the right thing. That is to call for peace and stability, to call to avoid any destruction, to call for minimizing conflicts, etc. That's the best attitude in dealing with Syria.
Perhaps the nasty scenario in Syria calls for strong leadership in continental Europe. I mean, it is after all the European Union that bears the brunt of the refugee crisis, and that has seriously undermined the unity of the European Union and has led to the devastating setbacks in the local elections in Germany. So don't you think we still need strong leadership in Europe so that a solution, a compromise could be found so that all major powers can be united?
You need support, you need leadership in Europe. But I believe if Assad clings to power, there will not be a united Syria going forward. That to me, for long term, would be the end of Syria as we know it. I believe the only way you could have a united Syria continue is if Assad left power and somebody who is acceptable to Russia and Europe, the rest of Europe, could be found. That may be very difficult. That may be a dream that's not realistic. But I think that is the only way to end the civil war, is to find someone who is acceptable to Putin and to Russia, but also is acceptable to the people who are against Assad.
Thank you, gentlemen. While the two major meetings are held in the United Nations about the refugees and refugee crisis, we go back to review the implications of William Shakespeare's quote, "To be or not to be," and that should be read in the context of the security scenario in Syria. Benevolence or justice, which should come across as the first? You want to do justice with the tyranny of the dictatorship, you have to keep in mind the livelihoods, bread and butter of the refugees. With that, we come to the end of this discussion about the future of a war-torn country, Syria, in the Middle East. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.